We had businessmen, industrialists, tech entrepreneurs, people with an interest in the commercial success of America and the West coming to us and saying, we cannot trust the graduates that are coming out of our elite institutions. They may be very smart going in. They may have a lot to offer on paper, but whatever is happening inside those walls for 4 years, for 6 years, for 10 years in some cases, we are not producing graduates who are adequately prepared to steward our companies. If we don't do something to reform education, we are not going to produce the kind of people that can actually steward our civilization.
Ben Crocker, welcome to the IPA. It's great to have you here today.
Scott, thanks very much. It's great to be back in Melbourne.
There's so much to talk about. So, Ben, you are, of course, the University Dean at the newly formed, the fantastic disruptor in American higher education, the University of Austin, Texas. I'll certainly be asking you some questions about that. I'll also be asking you some questions about how does a lad from Ingham in Queensland find his way via a Ramsay postgraduate scholarship all the way to the University of Austin, Texas. We've got a lot of ground to cover, but I want to start with higher education in America. It's certainly in the news. President Trump is in deep conflict, particularly with Harvard and also Columbia University. There's an appearance of crisis in higher education in America, but this is more than just President Trump, isn't it?
It is, Scott, and I think President Trump is asking the same question that any good Australian political leader might ask, or any good political leader, and that's, are our universities serving the national interest? Now, there might be a question further upstream from that says, should a university act in the national interest? I think most citizens would agree that at least on some level they should, or at least if an education institution is going to exist inside a nation's borders, then perhaps it owes something to that nation. And I think that's the question that President Trump has been asking. He's been asking Harvard in particular, and I think a good common sense impression, if you were to ask your average American on the street, is Harvard meeting the national interest? I would think they'd give you a resounding no, and I think that's why President Trump is taking up the cause with them.
Yes, and certainly the universities, like the Ivy League in America, but also the Australian universities, they do in fact claim generally that they are champions of the nation, as well as serving the older and more ancient goals of universities. Certainly ours talk about their ability to earn export income, and that's very disputable, but they certainly do make these claims. But Trump has also pointed out that for all of their claims of excellence, they're still very reliant on taxpayer funding, and that's really what he's put it on the table there, isn't it?
Yeah, he has. And look, if you look at what are these institutions actually investing these vast sums of taxpayer money in? Are they investing it in things that have to do with the quality of experience, the quality of education that your average American, or we could say in our case, the average Australian, enjoys when they go to university? That would be one metric, which I think most universities in most countries are failing pretty dismally on. But let's put that to one side, and let's say maybe there is a research interest that universities can fulfill, which is not necessarily always tied to teaching and learning directly, certainly not for undergraduates. A lot of the research that's taking place at these institutions has a dubious quality to it, or at least it's not all curing cancer, and it's not all coming up with the next evolution in computer science that might serve our technological ambitions. A lot of it is money that is wasted on the pet projects of faculty who I don't think in any meaningful way you could construe as meeting a common good test. I.e., is there any circumstance in which the creation of this new knowledge could be seen as something that is beneficial to society at large, even tangentially. I think President Trump has rightly deduced, and certainly many people around him have rightly deduced, that our universities are failing on that front.
And there's a lot of people reaching that conclusion in Australia, and there are two models of change essentially. One is reform of the system, and this is part of what President Trump's doing, but it's also what some of the state governors like Ron DeSantis or Abbott in Texas have been engaged in. So one model is higher education reform, not on the table in Australia at the moment, it seems, with a re-elected Albanese government. But the other model that we at the IPA are very interested in is the model of disruption, of if the existing institutions are failing in a mission, what are the opportunities to for a new university to come in, or a new provider of research and education to come in and do something different? And voila, University of Austin, Texas, dating all the way back to 2021. What brought it forth? What is the need it's trying to address?
Right. I think it was Kevin Rudd that came up with the term, in this country at least, of the education revolution. And I raised that term because what we're doing at UATX is an education revolution. And I asked the question, why do you have revolutions? Now, in the American case, the definition of a revolution, or maybe not the definition, but the reason that the American Revolution 1776 took place was not just to create something completely new, but to perpetuate that which we know is true, that which we know is good, to preserve civilization as we know it beneficially. So our revolution at UATX is an American revolution. It's one that seeks to take what we know is great about American higher education, particularly about the American Liberal Arts College, which we can get into a little later in the discussion, but and to protect and preserve it within a new institution. Now, as for the specific pragmatic actions that we're trying to take, the problems that we're trying to solve, number one, as I've already alluded to, higher education in America and increasingly in Australia as well is outrageously unaffordable for everyday people. The cost model is broken. Dollars get poured into things that have very little to do with education, luxury facilities, pet projects. Increasingly, we see ideologically driven expenditure.
In Australia, we have some of the highest paid university administrators in the world.
Sure. Huge silos of DEI bureaucrats, jobs that are that have been made up that don't serve the people who are paying the bills, which ultimately ends up being the students or their families. So the cost model was broken and getting worse, and we needed to solve that. Number two, we had an urgent need to preserve and to promote great teaching and learning. The ability of a great teacher to have a transformative impact on individual students and then in turn the trajectory of a country was something that we saw needed to be protected. And we wanted to create an institution that, yes, still prioritized research, still believed in publication, but returned us to a focus on the student and the magic of the seminar, of reading a great text and sharing in what we call the living conversation between teacher and student.
And we might come back to that in the Australian context where post-COVID, the campus experience has been challenged more than ever. With the shift to online learning, it seems to barely exist. But I think you had a third.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, the incentive for great teaching, or creating incentives for great teaching and great learning, needs to be urgently addressed in this country as it does in America. The third thing is, from a very practical perspective, we had businessmen, industrialists, tech entrepreneurs, People with an interest in the commercial success of America and the West coming to us and saying, we cannot trust the graduates that are coming out of our elite institutions. They may be very smart going in. They may have a lot to offer on paper, but whatever is happening inside those walls for 4 years, for 6 years, for 10 years in some cases, we are not producing graduates who are adequately prepared to steward our companies. So, that final, the final plank going into the creation of a new university was almost a very pragmatic commercial imperative to say, if we don't do something to reform education, we are not going to produce the kind of people that can actually steward our civilization. And there's a commercial risk to that. But then beyond that, there's a broad civilizational risk approaching if we don't have statesmen to guide ourselves forward.
Indeed, and hence the interest that came out of some big names in Silicon Valley. But it's an amazing achievement on behalf of the people who pulled it together that whilst you're generating that level of interest and excitement from people who want to get behind the university, there is also at the intellectual level a stellar cast of people who wanted to get on board. And certainly, I don't think it hurt your cause very early on that Jordan Peterson got involved. He spreads himself pretty thinly nowadays, but it certainly attracted a lot of interest. But certainly then heavy hitters like Sir Neil Ferguson, Ian Hersey Ali, and you can help me out with some of the other names. But you seem to very swiftly pull together this great roll call of academic advisors and teachers.
Yeah, I think with all great political and cultural moments, you're necessarily engaged in coalition building. And yes, we had a lot of prominent conservative thinkers, maybe prominent libertarian thinkers as well, who came together to say we need to do something to arrest the decline in higher education. But we also had people from the centre over to the centre left as well, who realised that this is a problem for everybody if we don't get this right. And so I think most notably we had Barry Weiss, who was at the time in the founding stages of the Free Press, her new journalist platform, which has gone been wildly successful.
Indeed.
And all of those people came together.
Michael Schellenberger, who we've had
who's been a friend of the IPA,
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
But look, all of those people came together. Understanding that some things transcend politics, and that in most cases, education is going to be one of those things that demands that we all come together and look very seriously at where we're steering our young.
No, it is very exciting. And then as you've been setting it up and preparing yourself for the first intake, and this is something which you have personally driven, has been the admissions policy.
Right.
And this has been a fraught area in the USA where, again, part of what President Trump and Governor DeSantis have been pointing out is the iron grip of DEI policies on admissions. And you've completely challenged that, and you famously published your own DEI policy. Perhaps you could start by telling us about that.
Yeah. I think you're referring to the Declaration of Independence of 1776, which I don't know if it's by law or just by convention. You have to have your DEI policies promoted somewhere on your website. So anyway, our solution to that was to put the Declaration of Independence, which we think, thank you very much.
It was an epic piece of trolling, I must say.
It was a good troll, but isn't it true? I mean, is that not enough? If you can build a great country on the back of that, then I think the principles espoused.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Say it all.
And this is now reflecting in an alternative principle to diversity, equity, and inclusion is merit. And that is really what's driving your admissions policy.
Absolutely. No, we decided that we could not allow even one skerrick of manipulable subjectivity, let me say it that way, in our admissions process. Now, this is in contradistinction to the entire edifice of American higher education, where a huge bureaucracy is set up at our most elite universities, where students are feeding in all manner of subjective inputs into the black box of college admissions. Not just that they're putting in subjective qualifications, but that the universities are sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously signaling for different identity groups to be expressed into those inputs. And so you have a situation where seemingly all of the diversity characteristics that you could imagine are prioritized in entrance to an institution. But the one thing that really matters, are you a really objectively smart person, is disregarded
or ignored, or indeed penalized,
or pushed down in the pecking order. Now, so what we decided to do is run a purely meritocratic admissions process. There are no essays which can be gamed by ChatGPT, or often even worse, written by a guidance counselor that's very highly paid, advantaging students who can afford to pay for the help. There are no co or extracurricular markers that you can put on to juice up your application, because what we see is students then playing up to that and filling up their applications with things like this. We just want to know, do you have a track record of academic excellence? Is it reflected in the score that you give to us on entrance? And if you're over a certain hurdle, then you get to be a member of our class. And we expect a lot of you in return for that qualification.
And just to close that off, so that's how many intakes have you had so far?
So we're just concluding our second intake. So our first freshman class walked in the door in September 2024, and our second freshman class will come in this September.
And what degrees will they be coming out with in your you're in your establishment phase?
Sure. So when you start a new university, at least in America, you're allowed to start with one degree generally. Ours is a Bachelor of Liberal Studies, which is essentially, the way I describe it to people is a great books degree, a liberal education with an entrepreneurial arsenal added. Probably the point of difference is that as well as a deep reading of classic texts, we also expect you to do modern STEM. So you need to have good quantitative skills in order to be a student at UATX. You really have to be an all-rounder.
Well, that's a great foundation. And I did want to ask about the great books, because this is one of your passions. So you applied for and were awarded one of the first, if not in the first round of the Ramsay Centre for Western Civilisation postgraduate scholars program, and you went to St John's.
That's right, St John's College in Annapolis.
Which has a great books foundation. So congratulations on being selected for that. What is special about a great books education and that you took out of it, and why you were so pleased to see it at UATX?
Well, there's a very special qualification for a book being considered a great book. People might squabble about, who gets to choose the canon. Why is one thing in there? Why is something else not in there? But what we call great books are texts that in all of human history, or we might say all of Western intellectual history, books that have been proven to tell us something true, maybe even something profoundly meaningful about ourselves. A phrase we often hear used is that great books are what tell us about ourselves. And a great books education gives somebody who undertakes it the opportunity to spend time immersing yourself in that canon, so that you come to what we might simply call self-understanding, self-knowledge. And my argument to any young Australian, any young American, any young Westerner is that you cannot and should not really aspire to govern other people or to lead other people until you've come to greater self-knowledge, until you've come to self-mastery. A great book's education is a way that you can have, I think, a consummate understanding of what that means.
Well, that is a terrific call to arms, I must say, Ben. But there will be people listening to this podcast who'll say, well, that's terrific and good on Ben, and I'm sure Scott agrees, and this is something the IPA is trying to bring. But the average young person, they're immersed on TikTok, they've got phones, the attention span's shorter than it's ever been. How's that ever going to work? Aren't you like... And perhaps you've got a real-life test case for us. How does it work when you find a group of bright-eyed 18-year-olds and you're suddenly asking them to read big fat books, possibly for the first time in their life?
Look, there is some fantastic literature, if you want to get into the research side of it, that shows you how really and truly, even people who might be considered to come from modest circumstances or don't have a particularly elite education behind them, really can read these books. I said that they're great books for a reason, because they contain something universally true about us as human beings, whether that's the way that Plato describes, the ideal city in the Republic, whether that's the beginnings of understanding human ethics in Aristotle, which then flows into politics a little bit after that, whether I think we're going to discuss Tocqueville perhaps in a little bit, Tocqueville's understanding of what democracy looked like in the New World. These things are not elite ideas necessarily. They've maybe come to be symbols of elite education in some quarters, but they are things that are so fundamental that the everyday person can understand them with a little bit of effort. I say...
And perhaps a little bit of guidance and assistance.
Yeah. I use the analog like this. If you're used to reading Facebook posts, I say this to young people all the time, if you're used to reading Facebook posts and tweets, then even something like the newspaper takes a little bit of getting used to. It takes what Aristotle might have called habituation. Trying to elevate yourself is not something that just happens overnight. Yes, it's true we live in the age of the short attention span, but we are not fundamentally necessarily wired that way. So with good teaching, with some dedication, with attention to detail, and with the will to do it, I believe that anybody can read these books.
And I'm sure you're producing evidence of that already.
We are.
I want to take you back, though. You started actually with a vision of a young man or woman before they've even reached the stage of going to college stroke university. So as I posed the question at the start, how does a lad from Ingham in Queensland finish up at the University of Austin, Texas as the university dean?
Yeah, that's a good question, Scott. My first scholarly and professional interest was classical music. So I had a similar upbringing to, I think, many people who live in North Queensland. I was born in Cairns, and I grew up on a sugarcane farm just outside of Ingham. My parents were not farmers. We just happened to end up living in the area, and so I got to experience that life, for a significant portion of my upbringing. But
the real Australia.
It is the real Australia, yeah. And people are real. People tell you what they think there. And I became very interested in music. I was learning the piano at home and playing in bands wherever I could, and so I studied music at the Queensland Conservatorium. That ended up leading me to Sydney. I had a career in music teaching. I really enjoyed conducting, so I did that a lot. But then about halfway through my time in Sydney, I ended up working at the King's School, which is a relatively prominent Sydney school. And I spent a lot of time in the boarding house there. I was an assistant boarding house master. And it was probably at that point where I became particularly interested in the formation of young people. So in other words, how are we creating, or how are we influencing?
Not just the knowledge that you're passing on, but how are you...
Not just an instrumental source, but what goes into the character. I think the school's motto at the time is academic excellence with character development. So that sort of set me on a trajectory to thinking about education more broadly. Come the pandemic, all of music shuts down. The orchestras are all closed. There's not really much for me to do other than to read as much as I possibly can for the better part of 2 years. And I became more and more interested in these ideas. The Ramsay Centre, which Tony Abbott and Simon Haynes and some others had been setting up in Sydney, offered its first postgraduate scholarships. And as part of that suite of postgraduate scholarships, they had one scholarship that you could take up to a place called St. John's College. Now, to most people, St. John's College, I think there's one at UCID, there's one at Oxbridge. Doesn't really mean much, St. John's College, America, but it is in fact the third oldest university in the United States. And it's the one that most conspicuously adheres to the great books model of education. And that is that there is no ideological overlay.
And is it correct that you actually knocked back the opportunity to go to Oxford?
I did.
In favour of St. John's?
I did. I was thinking I'd like to do a philosophy degree or a history degree. I did have an offer from Oxford to study history, but I was sort of, transfixed on what I had then learnt about this model of education, about the return to the book as the curriculum, the book as the real teacher. That, yes, lectures are very good, but why learn in that model when you can immerse yourself in the book? Plato is your teacher, Aristotle is your teacher, Tocqueville is your teacher. And I was fascinated by it. I couldn't look away, and I couldn't turn down the opportunity once it came up. So I decided to go to America instead of England. And there I really learnt about what it means to have a liberal education. Liberal education in the sense of an education befitting a free person, which I'm sure is of interest to everybody at the IPA.
Freedom is our foundational value.
Right.
And another one is self-reliance.
Right. And then I suppose being concerned with, how we're forming our young and having an interest in what kind of person creates what kind of society. That led me naturally first to working for Sir Neil Ferguson when the University of Austin was setting up. I had the opportunity to work with Neil a little bit. And then when the university was approaching the time when it was opening its doors, I became involved with them again. Ended up doing all the recruiting for the first class.
Can I just hold you on a second at St. John's? So you've gone there as a postgraduate scholar in the Ramsay Centre.
Correct.
Shorthand is always Ramsay Centre, but I like to remind people it was Ramsay Centre in Western Civilisation. And we at the IPAs, we had our Foundations of Western Civilisation program, which is dates back, I think, to 2010, 2011. But Dr. Bella de Brera is running that as we speak. So what does Western civilization mean to you, and where do the great books fit into that model?
Sure. Look, the term is less important than what it signifies. We can say Western civilization. I might just call it civilization, because it definitely is not absolutely exclusive to the West. But we call it Western civilization because the countries commonly known as the West are the places that inherit what we call the Western tradition. And it has a couple of tenets that run through it. But I would say I'll take it back to Greek antiquity, and the basic idea that you can hold ideas in contention. that Plato, when he's writing in in the Socratic form, and Socrates is leading his charges through the Republic, is saying, on the one hand this, but on the other hand that. It's that basic action of sifting through thought, of prioritizing the interchange of ideas, that gives Western civilization its life. Dialectic.
And that is the most precious thing to pass on. And our great frustration is to see in our schools and in some of the universities that we've audited some of the work that Bella's done, is that there is still the promise of what you call teaching critical thinking, if you like. But what is done in practice is simply a critique of that Western tradition. It is simply an ideology that pretends it's not an ideology. Ideas are important, and ideas can be contested. And so certainly at the IPA, our membership and people we talk to are concerned at the ideas that are passed on in schools through the national curriculum, kids being deliberately scared to death about things like climate change and a very one-sided view of history. But of course, the answer to that is not to present then to make sure that we're teaching just an alternative conservative view.
Right.
It's actually to cleave back to what you've just been talking about. And that's a little bit harder to do, of course.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's the problem with critical theories and the critical thinking, the way it's presented to young people. It's not actually critical thinking. It's criticism thinking.
Yes.
It's here is this thing which appears a certain way. Rather than evaluate it on its terms, let's tear it down. It's not critical thinking, it's criticism thinking. In most cases, the presumption is that if something is good, if something is in existence, if something carries with it, God forbid, a tradition, that there must be some, evil or some oppression at play in its rise to greatness. Critical thinking has...
and that's the real Foucault element there, that, all ideologies are just an expression of power and the power structures, and that's essentially where that critical thinking model takes you.
It's a horribly cynical way to view the world, and in a way it's understandable for adults who've been around the block a few times, but it's an awful shame that it's de rigueur for the raising of children now. And because this is not just something that exists in universities. Like all trends, it's swept through the education system from top to bottom till you have, the education of young people who are still in the stages of forming their faculties of reasoning, being introduced to a very cynical view of the world and a cynical understanding, like as you said, that we can reduce everything good to a power construct.
And of course, and the knowledge base isn't there, which is what we find when we look at the national curriculum. With the you would expect the national curriculum to talk about Indigenous Australians and the long and not always brilliant history of the European encounter with Indigenous Australians. But what you wouldn't expect is that right at the very foundation of what they're taught is simply about the dispossession before they're even taught about the First Fleet. So it's like, it's almost in media res. It's like we're going to talk about terrible things that happened to Indigenous Australians before we even explain how on earth did Europeans get here in the first place? Where did they come from? What were they doing? Who were these convicts that were on the First Fleet? And so you've got this sort of Manichaean view of what power structures are doing behind the ideas of Western civilization and our society, and then a complete absence of actual knowledge about any of our history. So,
and look, one of the terrible things about that mode of education is, absent a great books education, or absent a what we would call a liberal humanist education, the actors in that history who are not in the oppressed group are demons. They're dehumanized. So you couldn't even begin to have a concept that these British sailors, these British Marines who came to Australia and got caught in at times horrible and brutal drama, were mixed up in a tragedy of their own. They are instead pushed into the cast of demon characters, the bad side, the power side. It's just a rudimentary examination of human history, maybe even some philosophy, would open your eyes to the fact that these were not people who were sent from England on a mission to crush and destroy. And these were people that for the time may have had relatively little agency as well.
And Arthur Phillip read out the Great Charter, as Bella's described in her video, which guaranteed the rights of subjects of the Crown to the Indigenous people of Australia. So there was a moral code there, not always met in practice, but a very different story to what we hear. I want to then bring you on to a great friend of yours and becoming a closer friend of the IPA is Professor Patrick Gray, who is the Dean of the Centre for Arts and Letters.
Great man
at UATX. And he is, of course, our keynote speaker at the IPA's annual dinner in October. And tickets are still available, I might add, for anyone who's listening who's interested in getting to that. Patrick did his PhD at Yale, where I think the legendary figure of Harold Bloom was still something on campus. So at the risk of stealing some of Patrick's thunder for his keynote address, what role do you think literature plays in what we've just been talking about? Where does literature fit into Western civilization, and why should we continue to encourage young people to engage with it?
There is a realm of human understanding which is never fully accessible until one has taken certain actions, lived certain lives, partaken in experiences that bring about the kind of self-knowledge that I alluded to in my earlier answers. The problem that we have as human beings is that if we were to seek all of the requisite experiences that tell us about ourselves, that tell us who we are, we would live essentially anarchic lives. The role...
And we only get to go around once.
Correct. We have one...
A limited number of data points.
We have one try at this planet. We have material circumstances that we have to live within. Great literature, like great music, like great art, is a medium to take us out of ourselves and experience through the imaginative state what might better inform us in our own human experience. There's an element of entertainment, right? But there's something to the discovery of truth. There's something to the discovery of what it means to be a human being that is not gettable for the individual without the assistance of art, without the assistance of literature, maybe when we're dealing in more abstract things, without the assistance of great music as well. So literature is a medium that informs the human condition where the practicalities of being a human being in the world might fall short.
No, it's beautifully put. And I alluded back to Harold Bloom. So this was something to get in a plug for. One of the first things I wrote for the IPA was about the Western canon. Harold Bloom was at Yale and was unapologetically in favour of the idea that there was such a thing as a Western canon, that you could create one. You could have nice arguments about what's in and what's out. And that's one of the things that gave us at the IPA the cultural confidence to say, well, there must also be an Australian canon, which is something that is the universities are determined to say is not possible. Now, again, our view is, I'm not saying we got it completely right, but there is a case that books can be selected to the extent that they meet some of those criteria that you were outlining. And, famously, it's not enough to say that it's just about text, that instead of a novel being, Patrick White's Boss, say, is not the same as giving students something out of a magazine, or giving them, the text from a Facebook post and saying, well, these are all just texts which carry equal weight. There is such a thing as quality. There is something that's introducing into what is human, and we must do that. And increasingly, people are going to have to do that for themselves.
Right.
If they're not finding it in the universities, if they don't get the opportunity to go to the University of Austin, Texas, they're going to have to find their own way to it.
Right. Well, look, I'm reassured that all people do have an instinct for higher things. I think we live in very difficult and very noisy times when perhaps that instinct can be dulled. But it's something I think that C.S. Lewis draws on. I know if most of our viewers are probably familiar with The Abolition of Man that Lewis wrote, which is largely a book about education. It's very short, but it deals with this problem of the relativizing of everything, of saying that one experience is equivalent to the next. That our long-running idea that there might be hierarchy, there might be differences in quality, there might be higher things and lower things. That Lewis is warning us about the modern world's tendency to try and destroy that. But
he was writing that decades ago, and it only accelerated.
Yeah, like many good authors, it feels like it could have been written yesterday, right? But it's actually getting to a century old. So what Lewis recognizes is that each person, in his case, viewed through the prism of faith, each person has a spark for those higher things. That we do actually know innately, or we at least have a yearning to be oriented towards them. And so, yes, although circumstances can be difficult, and when you're not in a place like the University of Austin, it might feel like you're sort of shooting around in the dark. My advice would be to still try and listen for your own instinct for higher things, because it does work. And it will guide you to those things, even in awful and confusing circumstances.
Absolutely. And we will, I think, be quizzing Patrick when he comes to Australia in October for what this means for Australian higher education. And I won't put you on the spot today, but you are in a very unique situation, and I'll bring into shot. So for the IPA Academy, which is our flagship program, where we bring together the best and brightest young people involved in our Generation Liberty program from across Australia every year in late January, early February, for a pretty intensive week of discussions, lectures and seminars. And we've also had Tony Abbott will come in and do an address, and Peter Credlin gave up some of her time, which was an absolute knockout session, talking about the importance of leadership and courage. And you talked about the seminal work on America, or sort of post-independence America, Tocqueville's Democracy in America. But you also drew out a lot of what that meant for Australia as well. And your talk is up on YouTube. on our IPA Academy playlist, and we'll link to it in the notes. But I thought, would you give us the teaser trailer for your
Sure.
talk on one of your special subjects?
Sure. I should be careful saying my special subject, but because there are wonderful Tocqueville scholars out there, and many of them my colleagues at the University of Austin. But look, the reason I chose Tocqueville, I have one colleague in particular who you could almost parody, because he constantly reminds his young students, well, Tocqueville predicted this, Tocqueville predicted this, and Tocqueville predicted this.
And Tocqueville is, so we're talking mid-1830s,
and
a Frenchman
right,
traveling around America,
right,
trying to understand what this brand new democracy was all about.
Right. So Tocqueville is a Frenchman. He's an aristocrat. He's writing in the early to mid 19th century. And he's in the case of this book, traveling around America, making notes on what he observes in this rising democracy. Now, the book is called Democracy in America, but this is a great book. It belongs in this canon because, as I said earlier, these authors tell us universal truths. They tell us something fundamental about our nature as human beings. And ergo, you can translate that observation that Tocqueville is making about democracy in New World America as this nation pushes out across its own continent. You can translate lessons from that into what we have here in Australia. So the predictions they come as prophecies, really, that Tocqueville makes about the nature of the state, about the way that it may one day grow to suffocate individual creativity. You could apply that to tax. You can apply that to, commercial regulations. You could apply that thinking, but he recognizes something true about the nature of government. And that, I think, is equally, if not more applicable in some cases to young Australians who want to have a sense of, well, how did we get here? From the point of this massive disruption, of the First Fleet sailing in through Sydney Heads, to where we are now. What happened and what forces are at play, not necessarily in the legislature, but in the human heart.
In the culture.
In the human heart, which which absolutely permeates into the culture. And that's why Tocqueville is such a great author, because he's not talking about democratic structures. He's not talking about the mechanisms of government, although that inevitably gets covered. What he's talking about is the democratic soul. What is the human being in this relatively brief period that we call modern democracy, after all of the time that's gone before in the development of, as you say, human culture, identity, human behavior, broadly understood. And that's why I think you could read a book like that for the rest of your life and learn something about your own country.
And I think that was a terrific choice and a terrific presentation, because, again, in a society where the education system is not passing on the knowledge, there is no obvious way to think about what government is or what it's for. And certainly in Australia at the moment, there seems to be no cultural limits on what it is that government is expected to do.
Well, government is culture.
Yeah, and so government is the universal balm for all ills. There's no limit to what it should try and fix. If it wants to lock you down for 200 days to cure a virus, then then that's okay too. Any number of increased taxes, increased powers, and so on. And in a good society, you can always have arguments at the margins, but at the moment there just doesn't seem to be that bedrock about what is the what are the fundamental questions of democracy, and what's the spirit of democracy that we want to have.
Yeah, I mean, look, in a democratic culture, we might say like a healthy democratic culture. I'll put it very crudely: government is a thing maybe shouldn't be the thing at all times and in all places, but you could forgive a young person growing up in Australia today for thinking by default maybe that government is the thing.
Yes, everything is political. Every single thing is political, which is one of the reasons why the political system fails, because it's trying to answer every single question.
Right. And we know from experience of human history that simply doesn't work. You can look at any system where government has spread its tentacles over more than the things that it should. That we have inevitable decay.
And it's profoundly illiberal as well, because it means that instead of government being involved in the things around which there is a broad consensus, which is the establishment of property rights, the principles by which the democracy will operate, national security, it extends into every area of life, including the things that people profoundly disagree on. And, that is the nature of humanity, that we will disagree on fundamental questions. Best that government stays out of some of those fundamental questions and leaves room for different people to live their own lives according to their own lights.
I agree.
But that's perhaps a discussion for another day. Ben, thanks so much for coming into the IPA. We've had a great chat this morning about our Generation Liberty program and some of the exciting things coming up next. So we really appreciated your counsel. We thank you for coming to the IPA Academy. Hope to see you at many more. And thanks for appearing on Free Voices today. All the best with the UATX, mate.
My pleasure. Thank you very much, Scott. It's always great to be at the IPA. You're the hope of the side here for liberty and freedom in Australia, and more power to you for the good work you're doing.
Thank you.